Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gill, Eapen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gill@eapen.info. My guest today is Professor Lenn Goodman, who's Professor of Philosophy at Vanderbilt University. He has published over 24 books in Jewish, Islamic, and General philosophy, including books on truth and justice, political philosophy, biophilosophy, and comparative philosophy. Welcome, Lenn.
It's a pleasure to be here with you, Gill.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. So I want to start with one of your older papers entitled Science and God. You say religion, like sciences, seeks to thematize reality, but they differ in what they abstract from. Religions focus on values, often ultimates, you say, and the sciences seek causes, typically proximate causes. So territorial disputes then are misguided, and scientism in seeking to displace religion is misguided, you say. So what do you mean by that? Is science's effort to displace religion, how is it misguided?
Well, I think it would be valuable to distinguish scientists who are trying to understand the world from scientific people who are trying to claim territory in that realm and feel uncomfortable for whatever personal or historical or biographical reasons. They feel uncomfortable with religion. Maybe they had a conflict with their family or something, and they want to preclude religious discussions, and they think of religion as a competitor, as a form of ignorance and a response to fear that's generated by that ignorance. If we think about values, I think there are different kinds of values. Certainly, there's a value in understanding, but there are different kinds of understanding. The scientist typically wants to understand causes in often in a mechanical sort of way. But if you look at biology, for example, you're going to have to look at values and causes of a different sort. You're going to have to look at causes which are purposes. Think about physiology or medicine or evolutionary biology, where you have to understand what function an organ or an organ system or a behavior or a physiological process might play in order to keep an animal alive, in order to keep a lineage of animals going. We start looking at causes in a broader sense than merely mechanical. I think what religion is interested in is the question about the value that's being served, whether by mechanical causes or by teleological causes. In what purposes are these, and why are there purposes at all, and and how can purposes be served?
Yeah.
Religion is looking for ultimates. Sometimes scientists are looking for what's ultimately small or what's ultimately simple. And one of the things you find when you do that is that the simple turns out to be not so simple. The small turns out to be very complex. Basic principles turn out to require higher principles. And science has science verges into religion, and religion verges into science, but that leads to territorial disputes. Oh, you're preempting my territory, and you have no business talking about values when I really want to talk about how things came about rather than why they came about.
Yes. No, I sometimes think that um, in the realm of science, it behaves a little bit like religion, contemporary science. As you know, there is a lot of confirmation biases. The experiments tend to have more of, experiments designed to confirm something that we already know.
Yes.
And the confirmation biases, like if you're not in the club and not pursuing things that are well established, you tend to be, sort of pushed away from that. So,
Yes.
and religion has very similar characteristics. My problem, I'm neither a scientist nor a religious person, so I don't bring a lot of content to this discussion, Len. But my problem with religion is that it appears that politicians and crooks, generally speaking, use religion to control people. So it has become
Yes.
sort of a tool.
They do.
Contemporary.
They do.
Right?
And science is used the same way. It's kind of one of the problems about human nature. We can look back on the Salem witch trials or the Inquisition and see how terrible it is. And oftentimes people have difficulty seeing that their own behavior might mimic some of those exclusionary and oppressive tendencies. Well, it's not oppressive on my part. We on our side are the good people. We believe in truth and love and simplicity and inclusion and all those good things. So it becomes very difficult for people, whether they're scientists or religious people, or whether they're scientific. Fanaticism in general is a human ailment, and it's been used in all kinds of ways.
Yeah.
I can tell you about people being burned at the stake, and the people who celebrate the martyrs who were burned at the stake, and you have the Martyrs Memorial in Oxford, where I was in graduate school. We remember Latimer and others who were burned at that very spot not too many 100 years ago. But the people who did that burning were not above having it done to them. That's a. I think we need to separate the vices of religion or of scientism from the virtues of it.
Yeah.
Religious people, like scientists, want to know the truth, but they're looking for oftentimes different kinds of truth, and they become intolerant or oppressive when they think somebody is precluding the discussion that they want to have, and that oppression can become very nasty. It goes on now, and it has gone on throughout history. But I think it's a human weakness rather than a characteristic of science as it should be, or religion as it can be and should be.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I don't know a lot about this, Len, but I would imagine in the medieval times, to be an atheist was a very risky venture. I would think, right? You are basically going against the grain, so to speak. And I wondered in the current time, do we know we have approximately 8.3 billion people in the world? Do we know what sort of the religious versus non-religious break is in that entire population?
I think you've got to distinguish sincere and informed religion from ignorant and Me Tooism and just going along with the crowd.
Yeah.
And once you start doing that analysis, your census of populations is going to get very tricky. I think you're right in suggesting that most people in the world have some kind of religion, but even within the various confessions, I'll give you an example of that. I taught for many years before coming to Vanderbilt. I taught at the University of Hawaii, and I had a colleague who was a foremost scholar of Buddhism, and in his view, looking at the texts of early Buddhism, he found that the Buddha himself and the early texts that represent that tradition were atheistic. There was a religion, all right, but it wasn't a God-centered religion, and he made a big point of that. However, when I traveled to Taiwan and gave some lectures there, I visited everybody said you had to go to a night market, and I went to a night market, and it was vulgar and lots of neon and lots of shops and so forth. But in the middle of the night market, there was a temple, which was something over 200 years old, beautiful carved stone and so forth.
Yeah.
And in that temple was an altar. And in front of that altar were hundreds and hundreds of little icons all lined up. And joss sticks were being burnt for them, and paper money, symbolic artificial paper money, was being beautifully folded and left in front of them as symbolic offerings. And there were people there whose piety and sincerity I could not possibly doubt. But the idea that my colleague had that Buddhism was essentially atheistic was refuted there. There were dozens, if not hundreds, of those little gods being worshipped. So popular religion is one thing, and philosophical religion is another. And similarly, I think one has to do that analysis of distinguishing, shall we say, crowd behavior, where people want to exclude others that they somehow regard as critically different from themselves, from open, loving, inquiring sorts of understanding. One doesn't have to believe that somebody is an idiot or a wretch in order to understand that that person might have come to different beliefs and different practices and have been brought by different traditions and upbringing to a different way of life and a different way of thinking. In my opinion, I do a lot of comparative philosophy. In my opinion, we can learn from each other without having to become relativists and without having to just simply adopt each other's views. We can gain from each other, and the wise people of every generation have done that. They have been open. They have learned from traditions which are alien to their own, and yet have truths in them and virtues in their practices that are worth acquiring.
Yeah. So I want could we think about religion sort of a framework going back to the Buddhist philosophy? But if you think about that as a framework, just like philosophy, then it becomes a bit abstract, right? So can we have religion without gods in the popular sense? Is gods
There are religions without God, but one of the funny things about that, human people uh, seem to go looking for gods. So in the former Soviet Union,
yeah,
uh, it was that was an area where people were being persecuted for being religious, and if you were seriously religious in the Soviet Union, whether it was as a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim, uh, you could be sure that you were being spied upon. Many of the Russian Orthodox, which was the recognized official religion, well, the official religion in the Soviet Union was atheism, but the many of those who still attended and participated in the Russian Orthodox Church had to realize and deal with the fact that many of the officials there were there to spy on them and to be apparatchiks of the government. But one of the things that you found in that situation was that people who were good party members and hewed to the line of being, just as they were supposed to be, very atheistic, um, they became subject to all kinds of very rapidly spreading and widely accepted superstitions.
yeah,
You can see it most visibly if you visit a cemetery with graves from that period. They made quite a cult of the dead, and there were all kinds of interests in uh, necromancy and all kinds of superstitions, ESP. Some of them newly invented superstitions. They were trying to fill up a kind of spiritual gap by their own imaginative practices, or just borrowing from traditions that they might have heard of or gotten a little confused about. So I think in spirituality, as in nature, you know how they used to say nature abhors a vacuum. I think that's true of the realm of spirit as well. People try to fill in what they feel the lack of. And I think one of the values of a religious tradition is to try to provide some kind of intellectual and moral discipline to marshal and make sense of and guide those human appetites for something that goes on what you can feel or touch or smell or eat. you know.
yeah. So going back to the paper, this contrast between science and religion.
Yes.
In science, again, I don't have the statistics, but we generally find a high proportion of agnostics and atheists. And so, supposing that is true,
You mean among scientists?
among scientists, yeah.
Yes.
So, supposing that is true, then are you really drawing an equivalence between science and religion? In other words, are you saying religion is like science and vice versa?
I think they are like each other in the sense that both religion and science are human inquiries and human enterprises. As far as the prominence of atheism and agnosticism among scientists, the first thing I'd say is it's not as common as you might suppose. I was just talking to a physicist from another university the other day who's very involved with Catholic scientists, and there's a very high proportion of scientists who are serious Catholics or who are serious Jews. There are others who are inquirers and are trying to find out what it's all about. I think one of the reasons, now I can think of two reasons right off the top of my head why that atheism and agnosticism would be relatively common among scientists. One is fashion. People are very fashion conscious. You said at the beginning, we don't want to be left out. We don't want to be thought to be different. We conform our thinking to what we think will help us fit in. It's not something that just girls in junior high school, girls in junior high school grades would do. We'll do it to some extent.
Yeah.
That's one thing, is fashion. The other thing is that for some scientists, and I'm thinking of the really large minds among them, the ones who are really widely inquiring, the scientific enterprise plays a similar role in their lives to the kind of consuming role that religion plays for other people who are not scientists. So some people are literary people and poets, and some people are scientists, and they're filling a need. They don't always want to describe it as a spiritual need, but I think to some extent it is, and they may find religion unwelcome because it's telling them how to fill that need, and they think they already know a way to fill it, and they don't want to be told, and they don't see, some of them don't see a complementarity. Complementarity is very important, for example.
Yeah.
I named two examples. One very obvious one is Einstein. Einstein did not have a strong religious background, but he did have strong religious inclinations. And he had the idea that in studying nature in the broadest and finest possible way, he was getting close to the ultimate structure of things, and he was not adverse to saying that he was in some way seeing the mind of God. The other scientist I would think of, who's a little less famous but a very important one, think of Theodosius Dobzhansky, who was the creative mind who really founded neo-Darwinism.
Yeah.
That is to say, back in the 20s and 30s, evolution and genetics were at each other's throats. There was competition. The geneticists didn't like the fact that evolution was so teleological, and the evolutionists didn't like the fact that Mendelian genetics seemed so deterministic and tended to look at things in terms of mechanical causation.
Yeah.
What happened, what Dobzhansky did, was he was able to create a synthesis, which all students in biology today take for granted, between genetics and evolution, and explain how genetics provides the matter and the tools by which evolution takes place. Nobody who's a student of biology today would deny the importance of that synthesis. I think that Dobzhansky was a synthetic thinker. And I think that his being a synthetic thinker was part of his religious background. He was actually Russian Orthodox, not in the sense that they were spying at each other in the Soviet Union. He wasn't in the Soviet Union. Very spiritual kind of man. And I think his spirituality, I don't think it was the source of his interest in evolution and genetics. He was a scientist. But I think that the idea that things that seem to be enterprises that seem to be at odds with one another could be brought together in a higher synthesis inspired him to create that synthesis scientifically, and to see that it was parochial and mean-spirited to be for genetics and against evolution, or for evolution and against genetics. And that creative moment in science, similar to the synthesis that Einstein was looking for between when he was looking for a unified field theory, that desire to see the wisdom in all things and to recognize that wisdom might take different forms, that in itself, I think, is an area where a scientist who is broad-spirited enough can be inspired by religion.
Yeah.
Although many of them do get very territorial, as I said.
Yeah. So like you said, that is rare. So you talked about fashion sort of driving science, the need to conform as sort of.
Well, I said driving scientism. Whether fashion drives science, I take exception to that a little bit. That's a fashionable view, in fact, that usually gets fathered upon Thomas Kuhn. And I think Kuhn's a little more sophisticated than that. but anyway, I didn't want to stop you. Please go ahead.
No, I was just going to say you could make the same argument for religion too, right?
Yes.
Passion drives religion as well,
Oh, definitely.
and
That's
yeah,
the human flaw that we're what Aristotle said, man is a social animal. And being social animals doesn't mean just that we need each other to harvest the grain that makes our bread. That's part of it. Being social animals means we care about what each other think. And people who pretend not to are often the ones who care the most.
yeah. So if I understand you correctly, Len, one of the arguments you're making is that these things could be complementary if you
Yes.
really look at it in the broadest sense, and not have preconceived notions about it, right?
Yes.
And so, you mentioned in the paper, for example, Big Bang cosmology
Yes.
and Darwinism. So, Big Bang cosmology, as you know, we don't really know what happened before time started.
Hard to know. Hard to
Yeah,
know. It was a long time ago, and things were very different. We know that.
yeah. And
We
so
think we know that.
I guess our conceptions from the scientific side of religion and vice versa, I think there is some missed opportunities. Is that how you think it? How you?
Well, here's what I would say. Let me say one word about Big Bang cosmology first
Yeah,
of all, because I study a lot of medieval thinkers,
yeah,
Muslim and Jewish and Christian medieval thinkers, and I teach about that and I write about that. These guys would have given their eye teeth if they could prove, if they had any of the evidence that we have about the Big Bang.
yeah,
We know because of the Doppler effect that the universe is expanding.
right.
And if we project back, we can find a moment of an initial singularity, which is powerful evidence for the idea that the universe began. There are other possible interpretations, but the most likely one is that the universe had a beginning.
Yeah,
If any of those guys that I study who lived back in the 8th, 9th, 10th, 12th century, if any of them had known anything about that evidence, they thought it was not, they thought that there was no possibility of having such evidence of something that happened so long ago before there was anybody to watch.
right.
We do have that evidence now because of the redshift, and that would have been very, very exciting to them. That would have shown, oh, okay, well, it could have been, it could have been a big bang, and then there was a big crunch before that and a big bang before that, but it's kind of unlikely. The Big Bang is such a strong singularity that it gives us reason to believe that it all began. And then your theist would come along and say it didn't all just begin for no cause whatever. If you're a scientist, you ought to believe in explanations, and there are different kinds of explanations. We have to ask ourselves how it happened. We also have to ask ourselves why it happened. And one of the big lines that you can draw between science and religion is that religion is more interested in the why than in the how, and science is more interested in the how.
Yeah,
But if you think the question, if you think the lines have to be drawn as battle lines between science and religion, think about science and art.
yeah,
Think about science and art. They're not usually at each other's throats. There's religious art and there's also anti-religious art, but a lot of art can just be appreciated as art. It doesn't preclude analysis and it doesn't preclude feeling. It's part of it. Let me say a word about evolution since you raised that.
Yeah.
In my book, Creation and Evolution, I run an argument to the effect that evolution is another way of, to use a crude metaphor, it's another way of seeing the hand of God at work, because evolution has has provided a way by which purposes can be served And one of the fascinating things about evolution is that one of the things that evolves in the course of evolution is not just complexity. We can see that geologically as the fossils get more and more representative of more and more interesting and complex organisms. Not just complexity, but purpose itself evolves. So there's a dynamic in evolution which you have to be able to look at that with religious eyes to see that dynamic as something which is, as I said before, indicative of the hand and the handiwork of God. That's kind of very interesting to me. I'll mention one figure that I know some of your listeners will be interested in. That's Teilhard de Chardin, who was a paleontologist and in the early part of the last century, Catholic priest. It was considered a little heretical by the church because he was an independent thinker, but he thought there was, as he put it, in the labyrinth of evolution, if you try and classify all the different species, he thought there was Ariadne's thread. Ariadne's thread was the thread that she left behind to guide Theseus through the labyrinth and find his way to rescue her. What is the thread that Teilhard de Chardin is so interested in? It's the rise of intelligence. It's the rise of intelligence. You don't have intelligence in rocks. You don't have, he makes an interesting point about insects. Insects, because they have an exoskeleton, they can only get so big. And we've seen some big ones. Back in the Bishop Museum in Honolulu, I used to see the really big beetles, but they can only get so big because their exoskeleton would make them too heavy to get about if they got much bigger than that. Because of the limits on size, they have a limit on cranial capacity. And because of that, all their elaborate behaviors turn out to be social behaviors. That is to say, the bees, the termites, they elaborate their culture genetically rather than by learning and tradition as mammals do and as we humans do especially. So the insects represent this far you can go in the development of intelligence, and then you can't go any further. Whereas in the human case, evolution has allowed us, I can't say to develop our intelligence because we still make war and are intolerant and all of those terrible things, but it has allowed us to get to the stage we've gotten to and hope to be able to go further. One thing that we don't find in science, qua science, is hope. I remember Edward Wilson, the great entomologist from Harvard, talking about how beautiful the sunset over the water is, and how he hopes that all the different insect species will be preserved, partly because he studies them, and partly because he loves their diversity and their variety. But that love of the diversity and variety of insects, that doesn't come from science. It might motivate science. That's a religious and moral dimension, which scientists, because of fashion, to a great extent, preclude from themselves. They stop themselves from saying something about beauty and something about hope and something about worrying about our fellow creatures and our fellow human beings.
The weakness I see on the side is that it is really a marketing job, right? And so religions could take, like you say, Big Bang cosmology, or just call it Big Bang and Darwinism, and market that. It doesn't necessarily mean there is substance in the structure, right? So if you give religion something else, they would utilize that in that marketing program.
Oh, I think that's a little unfair. This notion of marketing, we market all kinds of inventions, and what are markets, after all? They're mechanisms for serving human desires.
Yeah.
Those desires can be wholesome or unwholesome. They can be desires for necessities or desires for luxuries. They can be desires for helping others or desires for suppressing others.
Yeah.
Marketing, like logic, is very topic neutral.
Science appears to do really well in the contemporary sense in incremental extensions, and we seem to be losing the ability to make really big changes. And I'm sort of agreeing with you, and I'm asking you this question, which is that because scientists are less willing to move away from, sort of a position of comfort and look at things that might consider to be, sort of peripheral?
Well, I can take a stab at that, but it's a question about the psychology and sociology of the sciences.
Yeah.
And I think, like any human question, you'll find a variety of answers depending on which scientists you're talking about.
Yeah.
I would start out in answering that question by saying that what's new and different is not necessarily better. I don't think, to mention Newton again, I don't think that Newton's work will ever be surpassed. It's fantastic work, but it gets absorbed in Einsteinian physics, just as they're trying to absorb Einstein's views within quantum. And if string theory proves out, they'll probably enlarge it rather than abandon what quantum theory has been trying to teach us.
Yeah.
I think that we mentioned Kuhn before. Thomas Kuhn, in his Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which is the book that gave us the expression paradigm shift, was saying that there's routine science and then there's revolutionary science. And as a historian of science, he was trying to explain what makes the difference. And part of what makes the difference is that people have a different way of looking at things. You can see a little of that in genetics, for example. The real revolution in genetics in the 20th century came from cybernetics, not because cybernetics taught us anything about genetics per se, but it gave us a language to talk about the transformation of information and thinking of genes as bearers of information was an extremely fruitful way of thinking about what DNA is doing. We're not just talking about the shape of the molecule, we're talking about the function of the molecule, what good it does for the organism and for the lineage of the organism. But there's a tendency, I think, because we get excited about what's new, there's a tendency to disparage what Kuhn was calling the sort of workaday scientist. But Gill, it's the workaday scientist who is finding a way of combating cancer or developing a vaccine. Sometimes we have a little breakthrough. The new mRNA vaccines that they're using now, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, are based on a new concept, a new approach to doing vaccines that we didn't have before. Is that a product of routine science? Not quite. There was some very creative work going on there. I think that there's a lot of different realms in which creativity can work. The shoemaker, when he repairs your shoes, can do so in a very creative way when he comes across a problem that he hasn't seen before. And we shouldn't disparage that day-to-day, workaday. Watch the gardener when the gardener does his gardening or her gardening, and you'll see aesthetic appreciation, you'll see values, you'll see problems being solved in a creative way. Sometimes there's a breakthrough. Sometimes it's not about a breakthrough, but it's still not anything mean or pedestrian.
Yeah, I'm not saying that, Len. I'm trying to make a different point, which is, in the paper you talk about sort of complementarity between science and religion. And,
Yes.
in some sense, in contemporary views, they seem to have sort of moved away from each other, right? And there are a variety of reasons for it. So I'm, sort of posing the question that was that complementarity important in making big framework type shifts in human knowledge? I don't know the answer to it. We don't have a lot of data points around it, but we can speculate. But
Sometimes,
yeah,
sometimes we get creativity from seeing one thing in terms of another.
yeah,
And we bring from a different realm of experience. It's a lot like what poets do when they create a metaphorical expression, and they see, oh, this is like that, and they show you an aspect of things that you hadn't observed before, and that's true. That's true of science. If you think about Pasteur, you think about Kekulé, you think about Helmholtz, great scientists. What they often were doing was bringing knowledge and experience from one realm into another and putting it to work. Some of the scientists, I mentioned Einstein before, some of them are very mathematical, and they can think in very abstract terms and then bring those abstractions down to very concrete applications so as to design or devise or propose experiments that would confirm their theoretical expectations.
right.
It's a synthetic form of thinking. We tend to think of science in terms of analysis, but analysis is only fruitful when it goes hand in hand with synthesis, and bringing one area of experience to bear on another is one domain, is one way in which synthesis can be very effective and very creative.
Right, right. And so in conclusion, Len, if you want to leave one thought for everybody, what would that be in the context of science and religion?
My one thought is this: keep an open mind.
Yeah.
Keep an open mind, because if you're religious, be open to the possibility that there's a deeper intellectual and spiritual and moral truth in science. And if you're scientific, don't be scientistic, and don't think you've got it all just because you're using a different language and a different pair of eyes, if you will, from your friends and your relatives who look at the world in a more spiritual way.
Right, right. Yeah, if we can bring those together in a complementary way,
that's right.
Out of that could be much more than each.
Yes, and it's also more loving.
Right, right. Excellent. Yeah, this has been great, Len. Thanks so much for spending time with me.
My great pleasure. I enjoyed it.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.